Imagine a war so brutal, so transformative, and so forgotten, that it quietly rewrote the rules of European power, medicine, and modern warfare. Yet today, few even remember its name. Before the thunder of World War I shook the trenches of Europe, before Napoleon's legend had fully faded, there was another war that tore the continent apart. It was fought not in the heart of France or Germany, but on the windswept, blood-soaked plains of the Crimean Peninsula. This was the Crimean War, a conflict that pitted the great empires of Europe against one another in a struggle for dominance, faith, and survival. It was a war that witnessed the courage of soldiers charging into almost certain death, the cries of men perishing more from disease than bullets, and the tireless devotion of a woman who would change medicine forever. Yet despite its scale and significance, history books often leave it in the shadows. A forgotten conflict that quietly shaped the modern world. To truly understand why this war matters, we must step back into a time when the world was shifting. The mid-19th century was an age of transition, the dawn of industrial technology, colliding with the old traditions of empire. The Ottoman Empire, once mighty, was weakening. Russia, hungry for influence and desperate for warm water ports, sought to expand its reach. But standing in its way were powerful rivals. Britain, determined to keep the balance of power. France, eager to reassert its military glory. And later, Sardinia, seeking its place among Europe's rising nations. What began as disputes over holy sites in Jerusalem spiraled into a geopolitical showdown that would draw in some of the greatest powers of the century. This war was unlike the grand battles of Napoleon, where lines of infantry clashed in neat formations and cavalry thundered across open fields. The Crimean War introduced something new: modern war. Telegraph lines carried news from the front to distant capitals in hours instead of weeks. Steamships ferried soldiers and supplies across seas with unprecedented speed. And newspapers sent home images and reports that shocked the public. For the first time, ordinary citizens could read about the horrors of war almost in real time, creating outrage and changing how wars would be remembered. On the battlefield, rifled muskets and powerful artillery unleashed devastating fire. While in the hospitals, the lack of sanitation killed far more men than the enemy's guns ever could. But beyond the battles and politics, this was a war of human stories. Think of Florence Nightingale, walking through darkened hospital wards by lamplight, bringing not just comfort but a revolution in medicine. Think of the infamous charge of the Light Brigade, a doomed cavalry assault that, though disastrous, became immortalized as a symbol of bravery and tragedy. Think of the Siege of Sevastopol, a year-long hell of trench warfare that eerily foreshadowed the horrors of World War I. Each moment was a piece of a much larger story, a story that reveals how Europe stumbled into the modern age through fire and blood. So why has the Crimean War been forgotten? Perhaps because it sits in the shadow of greater giants, overshadowed by the epic clash of Napoleon before it and the world wars that followed. Yet to ignore it is to miss a vital chapter of history. The treaties, signed at its end, redrew the political map of Europe, humbled mighty Russia, and forced nations to rethink their armies, their alliances, and their futures. Its lessons shaped the world to come, lessons about power, about progress, and about the cost of ambition. This is the story of the Crimean War, a war of empire, faith, and revolution. A war where modernity and tradition collided. A war that shaped Europe, but history tried to forget. The Crimean War is often called the Forgotten War, a conflict that history seems to have buried beneath the towering shadows of Waterloo, the Napoleonic Wars, and the world wars that would follow less than a century later. Yet to dismiss it as insignificant would be a profound mistake. For despite being largely overlooked in popular memory, the Crimean War was one of the first modern wars in Europe, a brutal collision of old-world empires and emerging industrial technology that reshaped the continent's political and military landscape in ways that still resonate today. It was a war fought not merely with swords and muskets, but with railways, telegraphs, steamships, and rifled artillery, technologies that transformed the scale and speed of combat, heralding a new era in warfare. The sheer complexity of this conflict, coupled with the staggering human suffering it caused, makes its historical neglect all the more remarkable. Unlike the more widely remembered battles of Waterloo or the dramatic campaigns of Napoleon, the Crimean War did not produce a single, overwhelmingly decisive moment that captured the imagination of generations of schoolchildren. Instead, it unfolded as a series of sieges, skirmishes, and attritional campaigns. Most notably the prolonged and grueling Siege of Sevastopol, a bloody struggle that lasted nearly a year and left tens of thousands dead. Disease claimed more lives than bullets, exposing the inadequacies of contemporary military medicine and the brutal realities of 19th century warfare. The reasons it remains forgotten are partly cultural and partly political. In Britain, the war was a complex entanglement of alliances, distant lands, and diplomatic objectives that were difficult to frame as simple heroics for popular consumption. While iconic moments like the charge of the Light Brigade captured imaginations, the overall narrative lacked the sweeping drama of Napoleonic victories, or the moral clarity associated with later conflicts. Across Europe, the war's outcomes were nuanced, with no single nation emerging as the unquestioned victor. Russia, though humiliated on the battlefield and forced to accept humiliating terms in the Treaty of Paris, remained a major power, while Britain and France secured prestige but at enormous human and financial cost. The Ottoman Empire, already in decline, survived only through foreign support, highlighting the fragile balance of power in the region and the geopolitical intricacies that made the war less suitable for simple storytelling. Yet this very complexity is why the Crimean War matters so profoundly. It revealed the vulnerabilities of Europe's great empires, the limits of military tradition, and the urgent need for modernization. Armies that had relied on outdated logistics and archaic medical practices were forced into rapid reform, lessons that would echo tragically and decisively in the world wars to come. Beyond politics and military strategy, the Crimean War is a story of human courage and suffering. Soldiers endured freezing winters, muddy trenches, and rampant disease, often with inadequate food and clothing. Florence Nightingale and her nurses emerged as revolutionary figures, not only saving lives but transforming the very practice of medicine in wartime. Journalists and photographers brought the war into the living rooms of ordinary citizens for the first time, making it one of the first televised conflicts of its era in a metaphorical sense. Readers were confronted with stark images of suffering and heroism, a combination that began to shape public opinion and political accountability in unprecedented ways. In these facets, the war was not merely a clash of empires. It was the collision of tradition and modernity, a laboratory in which the principles of industrialized warfare, medical reform, and public scrutiny were tested under fire. To remember the Crimean War is to recognize the origins of many aspects of modern conflict, the impact of technology on strategy, the importance of logistics, the vulnerability of soldiers to disease, and the moral imperative of compassionate leadership. It is a war that reshaped Europe's balance of power, weakened empires that had dominated the continent for centuries, and exposed the human cost of political ambition. While it may not occupy the grand narrative of history textbooks, its lessons remain vivid, relevant, and essential for understanding how Europe evolved in the 19th century. The Crimean War may have been forgotten, but its echoes continue to reverberate in military doctrine, diplomatic strategy, and the collective memory of a continent forever changed by its relentless fires. At the heart of the Crimean War lay a complex and volatile problem known as the Eastern Question, a geopolitical puzzle that had troubled Europe for decades. What would happen to the weakening Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe? This question was far more than a matter of territory. It was a collision of religion, empire, and influence, with multiple powers vying for control over lands, holy sites, and strategic positions across the eastern Mediterranean. Russia, the great northern power with imperial ambitions, saw an opportunity to extend its influence by asserting itself as the protector of Orthodox Christians within Ottoman lands. Britain and France, wary of Russian expansion, feared that if the Ottomans collapsed under Russian pressure, the delicate balance of power in Europe would be irrevocably disrupted. France, for its part, also claimed a role as the guardian of Catholic interests in the Holy Land, further complicating the religious and political stakes. This clash over influence was not confined to diplomacy and rhetoric. It quickly escalated into a military confrontation as competing ambitions collided on the battlefield. Russia, eager to assert dominance and secure warm-water ports on the Black Sea, began maneuvering aggressively, threatening Ottoman territories and raising alarms in London and Paris. Britain, whose empire depended on secure maritime routes to India and beyond, could not afford a powerful Russia controlling the Black Sea. France, still seeking to restore its prestige after the revolutions and upheavals of the early 19th century, found common cause with Britain, while the Ottoman Empire itself struggled to defend its own crumbling borders. Later, the Kingdom of Sardinia would join the alliance, hoping to gain favor and political leverage in the broader European order. The Eastern Question thus became the spark that ignited the Crimean War, transforming a regional religious and territorial dispute into a full-scale European conflict. What began as competing claims over holy sites and minority protections escalated into a confrontation of empires, revealing the fragility of peace in a continent entangled in centuries of alliances, rivalries, and suspicions. The war that followed was not merely a clash of armies, it was a battle for influence, prestige, and survival, where the ambitions of kings, the strategies of generals, and the resilience of ordinary soldiers converged in a deadly drama that would reshape Europe's political map. By examining the Eastern Question, we see how deeply intertwined religion, empire, and diplomacy were in 19th century Europe, and how a single unresolved problem could trigger a conflict that would leave tens of thousands dead, redraw borders, and alter the course of history. The Crimean War was more than a clash of empires. It was a turning point in the history of warfare, a conflict that introduced the world to the harsh realities and possibilities of modern technology on the battlefield. For the first time, railways and steam-powered ships transformed how armies moved, supplied, and reinforced themselves, allowing troops and equipment to reach the front lines faster than ever before. Battles were no longer limited by the slow pace of horse-drawn wagons or the endurance of men on foot. Entire divisions could be transported across difficult terrain in days rather than weeks, giving commanders new strategic options and changing the very rhythm of war. Telegraphs brought another revolution, enabling governments to communicate instantly with commanders in the field, coordinating operations over vast distances and providing the public with near real-time updates on the conflict's progress. Artillery and firearms had also evolved. Rifled muskets, explosive shells, and long-range cannons increased both the lethality and the scale of engagements, creating deadly new challenges for infantry and cavalry alike. Yet it was not only technology that marked this war as modern, it was also the way the war was witnessed, recorded, and reported. For the first time in European history, newspapers brought the horrors, heroism, and drama of the battlefield into the homes of ordinary citizens. Photographers like Roger Fenton captured haunting images of soldiers, trenches, and the aftermath of battles, offering the public a stark, unflinching look at war's human cost. These images and reports shaped public opinion in unprecedented ways, generating empathy, outrage, and even political pressure on governments to reform military practices and medical care. The Crimean War was, in essence, the first televised war, not through moving pictures, but through the combination of photography, journalism, and widespread public interest. This fusion of new technologies on land, sea, and in communications changed not only the tactics of battle, but also the relationship between war and society. Commanders had to adapt to faster-moving armies, more destructive weaponry, and the scrutiny of an engaged and informed public. Soldiers faced not just the enemy, but also the unrelenting power of machines and the unforgiving exposure of modern logistics. The Crimean War revealed both the promise and the peril of modern technology, a double-edged sword that could enhance efficiency while magnifying suffering. It set a precedent that would echo throughout European military history, foreshadowing the mechanized carnage of the First World War and transforming the expectations of both leaders and civilians in conflicts to come. In examining the Crimean War through this lens, we see how it became a laboratory for modern warfare, where innovations in transport, communication, and firepower collided with human endurance and courage. It was a war that tested the limits of technology and logistics, reshaped command strategies, and created a new public consciousness about the realities of combat. Far from being a mere footnote in history, the Crimean War marked the birth of the modern battlefield, a place where machines, men, and media converged in a way the world had never seen before, and a conflict whose lessons would reverberate for generations. The Siege of Sevastopol stands as one of the most grueling and pivotal episodes of the Crimean War, a nearly year-long ordeal that tested the limits of soldiers, commanders, and the very strategies of modern warfare. Situated on the southwestern tip of the Crimean Peninsula, Sevastopol was Russia's key naval base on the Black Sea, a fortress city bristling with artillery, tunnels, and defensive fortifications. For the Allied forces, Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and later Sardinia, capturing Sevastopol was essential to breaking Russian power in the region and securing a decisive advantage in the conflict. Yet what should have been a relatively straightforward siege transformed into a prolonged, bloody struggle that exemplified the brutality and complexity of modern war. Soldiers endured harsh winters, sweltering summers, and the constant terror of artillery bombardments that flattened fortifications and claimed countless lives. Disease ravaged the camps, and inadequate supplies added to the misery, turning the battlefield into a landscape of suffering as much as strategy. The siege was a grim ballet of trench warfare, artillery duels, and relentless assaults on fortified positions. Both sides dug deep into the earth, creating networks of trenches, redoubts, and tunnels that foreshadowed the trench warfare of the First World War decades later. Every advance was costly, every artillery exchange deadly, and every attempt to break the stalemate met with fierce resistance. The Allied forces, despite superior numbers and technology, found themselves mired in a conflict where courage alone could not overcome preparation, firepower, and tenacity. Meanwhile, the Russian defenders, isolated yet determined, endured bombardments, shortages, and disease with remarkable resilience, holding their positions against overwhelming odds. It was a war not only of weapons, but of endurance, where the human spirit and sheer will became as decisive as cannons or muskets. Amid the horror, moments of heroism emerged that would echo through history. The bravery of soldiers on both sides, the tireless efforts of medics and nurses, and the ingenuity of commanders navigating a new kind of warfare became legendary. Yet the Siege of Sevastopol also revealed the stark shortcomings of contemporary military logistics, planning, and medical care. Thousands perished not from enemy bullets, but from typhus, cholera, and dysentery, highlighting the deadly intersection of human vulnerability and the emerging machinery of modern war. These lessons, bitterly learned, would inspire reforms in army organization, battlefield medicine, and military strategy across Europe in the decades that followed. Sevastopol was more than a military objective. It was the crucible in which the Crimean War was forged, a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and the devastating consequences of modern conflict. The siege's protracted nature, combined with its human cost and strategic importance, left a lasting mark on Europe's understanding of warfare. It demonstrated how industrial-age technologies could prolong suffering and amplify destruction, and how even the mightiest empires could be humbled by determination, logistics, and sheer human endurance. In studying the Siege of Sevastopol, we witnessed the harsh realities of war's transformation, the birth of modern trench tactics, and the courage and tragedy of thousands caught in a struggle that would shape European history for generations to come. Amid the smoke, mud, and relentless artillery of the Crimean War, extraordinary individuals emerged whose courage, ingenuity, and compassion would leave an indelible mark on history, turning moments of tragedy into lasting legends. Perhaps the most celebrated figure was Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, whose tireless work in the field hospitals of Scutari revolutionized battlefield medicine. She and her team of nurses faced unimaginable conditions: overcrowded wards, rampant disease, poor sanitation, and staggering casualties, yet through their dedication, meticulous organization, and unwavering humanity, they drastically reduced death rates and transformed nursing into a respected, professional vocation. Nightingale's impact extended far beyond the hospitals. Her efforts highlighted the vital role of healthcare in war and set a precedent for modern medical practices, proving that heroism could be measured not only in valor on the battlefield, but also in saving lives behind the lines. On the battlefield, legends of courage and folly intertwined, none more famous than the charge of the Light Brigade. In 1854, during the Battle of Balaclava, a miscommunication sent the British light cavalry on a frontal assault against heavily fortified Russian artillery positions. Outnumbered and exposed, the soldiers charged into near-certain death, a scene of chaos and heroism that would be immortalized in Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem and etched into the annals of military history. The charge was a disaster tactically, yet it exemplified the bravery, discipline, and tragic futility of soldiers facing impossible odds, a narrative that continues to resonate as a symbol of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. Other figures, too, emerged as testaments to human resilience. Russian commanders and troops displayed steadfast determination, defending fortresses like Sevastopol, enduring starvation, disease, and unrelenting bombardment. French and Ottoman officers coordinated complex maneuvers and held positions under extreme conditions, while ordinary soldiers on all sides faced unimaginable hardships, proving that heroism in war was not limited to individual exploits, but was woven into the collective endurance of entire armies. Each act of courage, whether grand or quiet, shaped the course of the conflict and contributed to the enduring legacy of the war. The Crimean War was also a proving ground for the power of observation and storytelling. Photographers like Roger Fenton and journalists who risked frontline exposure captured and reported the grim realities of combat, turning soldiers, nurses, and civilians into heroes in the eyes of the wider world. Their work brought the human dimension of war into public consciousness for the first time, reminding Europe that heroism was not only in strategic victories, but also in acts of compassion, resilience, and moral courage. In the end, the heroes and legends of the Crimean War embody the paradox of conflict, devastation and valor, tragedy and triumph, death and transformation. Their stories illuminate the human face of a war often remembered for its strategy, politics, and technology, proving that history is as much shaped by the courage of individuals as by the movements of empires. These figures, Florence Nightingale, the soldiers of the Light Brigade, steadfast defenders of Sevastopol, and countless unnamed men and women, became the living memory of a war that would otherwise have been forgotten. Their legacy reminding us that even in the darkest chapters of history, courage, ingenuity, and compassion can shine with undying light. The Crimean War was a brutal awakening to the true cost of modern conflict, a grim reminder that technology and strategy could magnify human suffering rather than diminish it. Soldiers faced not only enemy fire, but also the relentless grip of disease, starvation, and exposure, with typhus, cholera, and dysentery claiming more lives than the battlefield itself. Winter and summer brought their own torments: freezing cold, flooded trenches, blistering heat, and mud that swallowed men, horses, and cannons alike. Armies camped in squalid conditions, often with inadequate clothing, shoes, and rations, while medical systems struggled to cope with the sheer scale of casualties. The inadequacies of sanitation and care turned hospitals into death traps, a fact that highlighted the desperate need for reform and the pioneering work of nurses like Florence Nightingale, who fought tirelessly against both disease and bureaucracy. Artillery barrages and rifle fire made even the smallest advances deadly. Trenches became killing fields, and fortresses like Sevastopol transformed into landscapes of unending carnage. Soldiers endured constant bombardments, watching friends and comrades fall while waiting days or weeks for reinforcements. Cavalry charges and frontal assaults, often guided by outdated tactics in the face of modern weaponry, resulted in staggering losses. The infamous charge of the Light Brigade epitomized this tragic mismatch. A disciplined, courageous unit decimated by miscommunication and the superior firepower of the enemy. Such moments of valor were inseparable from horror, blending heroism with futility in ways that haunted survivors and observers alike. The war's horrors were not confined to the battlefield. Civilian populations around the Crimean Peninsula were uprooted, displaced, and terrorized by military operations. Supply lines stretched thin, leaving both armies and local communities vulnerable to famine and deprivation. Photographers and journalists documented these atrocities, exposing Europe to the grim realities of war for the first time on a massive scale. Public outrage over conditions spurred political pressure, highlighting how the horrors of the front could reverberate far beyond the battlefield and influence governments, alliances, and reform. In every sense, the Crimean War shattered illusions of glory and honor, revealing the raw, unflinching truth of industrialized warfare. It was a conflict that demanded courage and endurance while simultaneously exposing the fragility of human life in the face of modern weaponry, disease, and logistical failure. Its lessons were profound. Strategy alone could not guarantee victory. Technology could be as deadly to its operators as to its intended targets. And the human cost of war could never be fully measured in numbers alone. By confronting these horrors, Europe was forced to reckon with the consequences of its ambitions, laying the groundwork for medical, logistical, and tactical reforms that would echo for decades. The Crimean War may have been forgotten in popular memory, but its vivid depiction of human suffering, resilience, and the terrifying power of modern technology ensures that its lessons remain a chilling and essential chapter in the story of warfare. When the guns fell silent, the Crimean War left Europe shaken and forever changed, not only by the staggering loss of life but also by the reshaping of political alliances and the recalibration of power on the continent. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1856, officially ended hostilities, but it did more than simply draw borders or dictate territorial concessions. It humiliated Russia, stripping it of key influence over the Black Sea and curbing its naval ambitions. For Britain and France, the war was a demonstration of military reach and alliance building, but the immense cost in lives, resources, and morale highlighted the fragile nature of victory. The Ottoman Empire, though surviving the conflict, remained dependent on foreign powers, exposing its vulnerability and accelerating internal reforms that were desperately needed to maintain sovereignty. Sardinia's participation, though limited, allowed it to gain diplomatic favor, subtly reshaping Italy's role in European affairs. Beyond treaties and territorial adjustments, the war's aftermath had profound human and institutional consequences. Russia, humiliated and exposed, embarked on a series of reforms, from modernizing its army to re-evaluating social and economic structures, laying the groundwork for changes that would culminate decades later in revolutionary upheaval. In Britain and France, public outrage over the conditions faced by soldiers and the mismanagement of supplies prompted sweeping military and medical reforms, with Nightingale's innovations in nursing and sanitation setting a global standard. Politically, the war demonstrated that no empire, regardless of size, could act with impunity in a complex international landscape. Alliances, public opinion, and technological adaptation had become as decisive as traditional military might. The Crimean War also left an enduring mark on diplomacy itself. It highlighted the importance of coalition warfare, negotiation, and the careful balancing of power in Europe, lessons that would echo in subsequent conflicts and shape the strategic thinking that led to World War I. Nations became acutely aware that modern warfare was no longer merely about battlefield victories. It was about sustaining armies, managing resources, projecting influence, and maintaining legitimacy at home and abroad. The war forced leaders to confront the realities of modern industrialized conflict, the staggering costs, the human toll, and the necessity of planning not only for battle but also for the political and humanitarian consequences that followed. In the end, the aftermath of the Crimean War was a sobering revelation of the intertwined nature of war, diplomacy, and society. The battles may have ended, but the lessons endured. a testament to the enduring impact of a conflict often overlooked in history books. Empires were tested, societies reformed, and the European balance of power was subtly but irrevocably altered. While the war may be forgotten in popular memory, its consequences, political, social, and military, continued to shape the course of Europe for decades, influencing how nations would fight, negotiate, and remember the cost of ambition. The Crimean War, in its aftermath, proved that the echoes of conflict extend far beyond the battlefield, leaving an indelible imprint on history itself. The Crimean War may have been overshadowed by the great conflicts that followed, but its legacy reverberates through history in ways both profound and enduring. It was the first modern war in Europe, a testing ground for technology, tactics, and medical innovation, and its lessons would shape military thinking for decades to come. The conflict revealed the devastating efficiency of industrialized weaponry, the importance of logistics, and the critical role of communication. Lessons that foreshadowed the horrors of World War I and forever. Changed how armies prepared for battle. Beyond strategy and technology, the war forced nations to confront the human cost of conflict, prompting sweeping reforms in healthcare, sanitation, and the treatment of soldiers. Figures like Florence Nightingale became symbols not only of compassion but of systemic change, demonstrating that one person's vision and determination could transform institutions and save countless lives. Politically, the war reshaped the European balance of power. Russia, humiliated yet resilient, embarked on reforms that would gradually modernize its military and society, sowing seeds that would influence both revolution and imperial ambition. Britain and France learned the necessity of coalition warfare, the limitations of unprepared armies, and the influence of public opinion, while the Ottoman Empire's survival, though fragile, underscored the ongoing complexity of European diplomacy. Sardinia's involvement foreshadowed Italy's rising role in continental affairs, illustrating how even smaller powers could leverage conflicts to their strategic advantage. The Crimean War also left an indelible mark on journalism and public consciousness, as newspapers and photographers brought the realities of war to the public like never before, creating a new era in media and shaping how societies perceived military action. Ultimately, the war's legacy is not measured solely in treaties or casualties, but in the profound transformations it triggered across Europe. It highlighted the convergence of technology, politics, and human endurance. It demonstrated that wars are fought not only with armies but with ideas, reforms, and leadership. The Crimean War stands as a bridge between old-world conflicts and the modern age, a reminder that even forgotten wars can leave a lasting imprint on nations, societies, and the course of history itself. It teaches us that ambition, innovation, courage, and tragedy are inseparable threads in the tapestry of human conflict. Though often neglected in popular memory, the echoes of the Crimean War continue to resonate, shaping how Europe understood power, modernity, and the price of war. Lessons that remain vital even today. The Crimean War may have been forgotten by many, yet its story is impossible to ignore once you see its impact. A brutal, transformative conflict that reshaped Europe, modernized warfare, and revealed both the resilience and the fragility of humanity. From the icy trenches of Sevastopol to the revolutionary work of Florence Nightingale, from the charge of the Light Brigade to the political upheavals that followed, the war reminds us that even in the darkest times, courage, innovation, and sacrifice can leave a lasting mark on history. It was a war of empires and alliances, of ambition and endurance, and of lessons learned at an unimaginable cost. Lessons that continue to influence military strategy, diplomacy, and the way we understand the human side of conflict. As we reflect on the Crimean War today, it becomes clear that remembering forgotten conflicts is not just about honoring history, but about understanding the forces that shape the world we live in. The echoes of this war remind us that every decision, every battle, and every act of courage carries consequences far beyond the battlefield. History is not just a record of dates and names. It is the story of human ambition, struggle, and transformation. By revisiting the Crimean War, we gain insight into how Europe evolved, how modern warfare emerged, and how the bravery and resilience of ordinary people can change the course of history. If you found this exploration of the Crimean War insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth historical documentaries that uncover the untold stories that shaped our world. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the past, where history's forgotten conflicts reveal lessons, heroes, and moments that still resonate today. Leave a comment below telling us which part of the Crimean War surprised you the most. Was it the innovations, the human courage, or the staggering scale of suffering? Your thoughts keep the conversation alive and help bring history to life. History is not just in textbooks, it's in the stories we remember, the lessons we carry, and the moments we share. The Crimean War may have been forgotten, but by exploring it, we ensure that its echoes continue to inform, inspire, and remind us of the true cost and power of human conflict. Join us, and let's uncover the stories that history almost let slip away.